on consumer surplus. Consumer surplus, simply the difference between the price that one is willing to pay and the price one actually pays for a particular product. The essence of the concept of consumer surplus is that a consumer derives extra satisfaction from the purchases he makes over the price he actually pays for them. So basically, what we're saying is that whatever he was willing to pay is greater than whatever he's actually paying. So he's able to derive extra satisfaction. From the purchases he daily makes. Yeah. In other words, people generally get more utility from the consumption of goods and the price they actually pay for it. It has been found that people are prepared to pay more price for the goods than they actually pay for them. This extra satisfaction which the consumer obtains from buying a good has been called consumer surplus. Thus, Marshall defines the consumer surplus in the following words: excess of the price which a consumer would be willing to pay rather than go without a thing over that which he actually does pay. In the economic measurement of the surplus satisfaction may be called the consumer surplus. Just the same definition that's written here in just more words. The amount of money which a person is willing to pay for a good indicates the amount of utility he derives from it, because that's what Marshall said. This is a Marshallian concept. So if you remember, when we studied cardinal utility, we said that Marshall propagated the idea of utility as something which you're able to quantify, because it is the amount that you are willing to pay for it, right? So the greater the amount of money is willing to pay, the greater the utility he obtains from it. Therefore, marginal utility of a unit of good determines the price of a consumer will be prepared to pay for that unit. Okay, the total utility which a person gets from the good is given by the sum of marginal utilities of the units of good purchased. We already know what total utility is. It's a summation of mu according to Marshall, and the total price which he actually pays is equal to the price per unit of the good multiplied with the number of units, price into quantity, right? So consumer surplus, what a consumer is willing to pay minus what he actually pays, that is the summation of marginal utility, which is total utility, minus the price into number of units of a commodity purchase. Just in case you want to write this, you can. Price into quantity. The concept of consumer surplus is derived from the law of diminishing marginal utility. As we purchase more units of the good, its marginal utility goes on diminishing. It is because of the diminishing marginal utility that consumers' willingness to pay for additional units of commodity declines, because marginal utility is diminishing. As he buys more and more units of that commodity, the consumer is in equilibrium when marginal utility becomes equal to the given price. Again, this is something that we know, that equilibrium is when the marginal utility is equal to the price. In other words, consumer purchases the number of goods for a commodity in which the marginal utility is equal to the price. This means that the margin, at the margin, what a consumer will be willing to pay, which is marginal utility, is equal to the price which he actually pays, correct? But for the previous units which he purchases, his willingness to pay or marginal utility he derives from the commodity is greater than the price that he actually pays for them, correct? Because you're saying that whenever both of these equate and price is going to be constant, right? So at least that's what we're assuming, that price is going to be constant in this case. So if you're saying that marginal utility needs to be equated with the price that you pay, and marginal utility is declining, so when, let's say, at point A there is an inclination between, okay, sorry about that. So at point A this is equated, but at all of these points that we have here, marginal utility was greater than the price, correct? That's what it's saying. So this is because of the price. This is because the price of commodity is constant. Correct. Marshall's measurement of consumer surplus. Consumer surplus measures extra utility or satisfaction which a consumer obtains from the consumption of a certain amount of commodity over and above the utility of his market value. Thus, the total utility obtained from consuming water is immense, while its market value is negligible. We already read about the water diamond paradox, or the paradox of value. So, it is due to the occurrence of a diminishing marginal utility that a consumer gets total utility from the consumption of commodity greater than the utility of its market value, right? Because marginal utility keeps on declining, the total utility is going to be the summation of all of them, and thus it is going to be greater than the utility of its market value. Marshall tried to obtain the monetary measure of his surplus, that is, how many rupees his surplus of utility is worth to the consumer. It is the monetary value of his surplus that Marshall called consumer surplus. To determine this monetary measure of consumer surplus, we are required to measure two things. First, the total utility in terms of money that a consumer expects to get from the consumption of a certain amount of commodity. Okay, this is the first thing that we want in order to plot. Second, the total market value of the amount of commodity consumed, right? What is the market value? What is the amount that is there in the market of that commodity price, basically? It is quite easy to measure the total market value, as it is equal to market price of a commodity multiplied by the total units. An important contribution of Marshall has been the way he devised to determine the monetary measure of the total utility a consumer obtains from the commodity. So consider 15.1, which has been graphically shown in figure 15.1. Suppose the price of a commodity is 20 per unit. At price 20, the consumer is willing to buy only 1 unit of the commodity. At 20, is buying 1 unit. At price 20, the consumer is willing to buy only 1 unit of the commodity. This implies the utility which the consumer gets from the first unit is worth 20. Otherwise he would have not purchased it as it at this price. So as we said initially, that the marginal utility has to be greater, because that's the reason why somebody would buy. If the value that I'm giving to the utility that I derive from the first unit of, let's say, a cake piece is 20 and the market price of it is 200, why am I going to buy it? Correct? That is the approach behind all whatever we've read here and before this. So the consumer is willing to buy only 1 unit, otherwise he would have not purchased it. When the price falls to 18, he is prepared to buy the second unit also, because he's saying that okay, the amount of utility that I'm deriving is 20. Since the price of commodity is 20 here, but it's writing 12 here, I think this is a misprint. Okay, I think this is a misprint. This has to be 12. Okay. Okay. So marginal valuation, the value that you give to that unit is 20, whereas the price is 12, so you're going to buy it. Okay, the value that you're driving is more. When the in the second the price falls to 18, is prepared to buy the second unit also. This again implies that the second unit of the commodity is at least worth 18 to him. Further, he is prepared to buy third unit at price 16, which means that okay, this is the price that we are giving, okay, to something. So 18 pay, you're going to buy the second unit also. Okay. This again implies that the second unit of the commodity is worth at least 18. Okay. Further, he is prepared to buy the third unit at 16. कि 16 की होगी तो मैं खरीद लूँगा, और 12 की है तो वो खरीद लेगा. Similarly, this goes on until now we can interpret the demand prices of these units in a slightly different way. The price that the consumer is prepared to pay for the various units of the commodity means the margin valuation he places on these units of commodity demanded by him. Okay, this is the definition of margin valuation which is given here. This margin valuation of a unit of a commodity shows the willingness of the individual to pay. This is the willingness to pay basically. Okay. However, तो ये बस इसको हटा ही दो. However, actually he is not to pay the sum of money equal to the marginal valuation. वो लेवल नहीं है जो वो पे करेगा, वो लेवल है जो वो पे करने के लिए रेडी है. Okay, for all the units of the commodity he has to pay the current market price. Suppose the current market price is 12. He will be it will be seen from table 15.1 and figure 15.1 that the consumer will buy 5 units of the commodity because his margin valuation of the fifth unit is just equal to 12. This shows that his margin valuation of the first 4 units is greater than the market price that he actually buys for it, pays for it. He will therefore obtain surplus or net marginal benefit of 8 from the first unit, 6 from the second, 4 from the third, 2 from the fifth, and so on. He thus obtains consumer surplus or total benefit from 5 units equal to 20. So 8 plus 6 plus 4 plus 2. ये कंज्यूमर सरप्लस है, ये आपका प्राइस है, प्राइस लाइन है ये. ठीक है, आपको इसमें भी दिखा दूँ एक बार. ये 12 इधर, ये दोनों इक्वल हो गए. सो ये प्राइस नहीं, सपोज द प्राइस ऑफ अ कमोडिटी नहीं, दिस इज़ द मार्जिनल वैल्यूएशन ऑफ द कमोडिटी जो आप उसको अलॉट कर रहे हो प्राइस. बेसिकली ऐसे करके लिखना चाहिए था. आई थिंक दैट शुड हैव बीन बेटर. एंड दिस ऑल इक्वल्स टू 20. ओके. मेजरमेंट ऑफ कंज्यूमर सरप्लस इज एरिया अंडर द डिमांड कर्व. डिमांड कर्व के अंडर जो एरिया है उसके अकॉर्डिंग हम देखते हैं. द एनालिसिस ऑफ कंज्यूमर सरप्लस मेड अबव इज बेस्ड ऑन डिस्क्रीट यूनिट्स ऑफ कमोडिटी. फिर देखो इधर कोई डिमांड कर्व नहीं है ना, डिस्क्रीट यूनिट्स पे जो जो आपकी मार्जिनल वैल्यू आ रही है अपने वो प्लॉट कर दी है एक हिस्टोग्राम की तरह, और उसके बाद प्राइस लाइन इधर दिखा कर कंज्यूमर सरप्लस ऐसे करके दिखा दी. पर अब हम देखते हैं कि डिमांड कर्व में कैसे प्लॉट होगा ये. The analysis of consumer surplus made above is based on discrete units of commodity. If we assume that the commodity is perfectly divisible, that is actually usually made in economic theory, the consumer surplus can be represented by the area under the demand curve. The measurement of consumer surplus with the commodity from the demand curve is illustrated in 15.2, which along the x-axis the amount of commodity has been measured, and on the y-axis the margin, utility or willingness to pay of the commodity is shown, and the price of the commodity are measured. dt is the demand or marginal utility curve which is sloping downward, indicating that as the consumer buys more and more of the unit, his willingness to pay for the additional unit of commodity, or in other words marginal utility which he gets from the commodity falls. हमें ऑलरेडी पता है कि डिमांड कर्व जो है वो स्लोप करता है डाउनवर्ड बिकॉज ऑफ मार्जिनल यूटिलिटी, बिकॉज इट कीप्स ऑन डिक्लाइनिंग ब्ला ब्ला. As set up of marginal utility shows the price which a person will be willing to pay for the different units rather than go without them. अच्छा, इसको भी आप अंडरलाइन एक बार कर सकते हो because I am not sure if this is in words written somewhere else or did I just miss out. Remember, if OP is the price that prevails in the market, then the consumer will be in equilibrium when he buys OM units of the commodity. Since OM units at OM units marginal utility is equal to the given price. अब ये देखो, ठीक है, ये देखो, तो वो कह रहा है OP जो है वो प्राइस है, ये प्राइस लाइन है. ठीक है, तो इसके जो ऊपर वाला है इट इज़ वो जो क्वांटिटी आपने बाय करी 1 2 3 4 M तक जो आपने क्वांटिटी बाय करी, वो सारी की सारी क्वांटिटी पे जो आपको मार्जिनल यूटिलिटी मिल रही थी, ठीक है, ये इधर जो मिल रही थी मार्जिनल यूटिलिटी, वो ज़्यादा थी प्राइस थे. ठीक है, the mth unit of the commodity does not yield any consumer surplus to the consumer since this is the last unit purchased, and for this price paid is equal to marginal utility. ये हमने इधर भी देखा कि प्राइस पेड मार्जिनल यूटिलिटी या मार्जिनल वैल्यूएशन के इक्वल था, इसलिए इस पर कोई कंज्यूमर सरप्लस नहीं होगा, ज़ीरो है. ठीक है, और इधर माइनस वाला केस भी दिखाया हुआ है वैसे. ओके, the total utility of the certain quantity of a commodity to a consumer can be known by summing up the marginal utilities of the various units purchased, like इधर. ठीक है, ज़ीरो इक्विलिब्रियम है बेसिकली, तो इसके बाद आप बाय नहीं करोगे वैसे, क्योंकि आपको नेगेटिव यूटिलिटी मिलनी चालू हो जाएगी. ठीक है। इन फिगर 15.2 द टोटल यूटिलिटी डिराइव द कंज्यूमर फ्रॉम OM यूनिट्स ऑफ द कमोडिटी विल बी इक्वल टू द एरिया अंडर द डिमांड और मार्जिनल यूटिलिटी कर्व अप टू पॉइंट टाइम, जो मैंने दिखाया अभी. That is total utility of OM units in figure 15.2 is equal to ODSM. In other words, the OM units the consumer OM units of good, the consumer will be prepared to pay the sum equal to ODSM. ठीक है, ODSM. OPSM, sorry, OPSM. ठीक है. No, sorry, ODSM इज अमाउंट ऑफ मनी दैट इज़ रेडी टू पे, एंड ये सारा उसका सरप्लस है जो उसके पास बच गया. ठीक है. बट गिवन द प्राइस OP द कंज्यूमर विल एक्चुअली पे फॉर OM यूनिट्स ऑफ द गुड द सम इक्वल टू OPSM. ठीक है, क्योंकि ये सारा तो उसको डिराइव हो गया. ठीक है. ये उसका this is the amount that he actually pays. It is thus clear that the consumer derives extra utility to ODSM. extra utility ODSM से derive करता है minus OPSM, which is this amount. वो prepared है ये sum पे करने के लिए. वो एक्चुअली में ये पे करता है और ये उसका सरप्लस है. ठीक है. दिस इज अगेन समथिंग दैट्स वर्थ ड्राइंग. ठीक है. To conclude, when we draw a demand curve, the monetary measure of the consumer surplus can be obtained by the area under the demand curve over and above the rectangular area representing the total market value P into Q. P into Q है ना, of the amount of the commodity purchased. ये आप underline कर सकते हैं. Monetary measure of the consumer surplus can be obtained by the area under the demand curve over and above the rectangular area representing the total market value. कि मार्केट में उस चीज़ की वैल्यू कितनी है. ठीक है. P into Q. इफ़ द मार्केट प्राइस ऑफ द कमोडिटी राइजेज अबव OP से बढ़ जाती है तो उसका कंज्यूमर सरप्लस कम हो जाएगा. ठीक है. will buy fewer units of the commodity than OM. As a result, consumer surplus obtained by him from his purchase will decline. So if price increases, consumer surplus decreases. Very evidently from the graph. ठीक है. मान लो इधर कहीं आ जाएगा तो कंज्यूमर सरप्लस सिर्फ ऊपर वाला एरिया रह जाएगा ना, सिर्फ इतना एरिया रह जाएगा. As a result, consumer surplus obtained by him from this purchase will decline. On the other hand, if the price falls below OP, the consumer will be in equilibrium when is purchasing. Yeah, vice versa, of course, true. Lower the price, greater the consumer surplus. It is worth noting here that in analysis of consumer surplus, we have assumed that perfect competition prevails in the market, so the consumer pays the given price, whatever the amount of commodity he purchases. But if the seller of a commodity discriminates the price and charges different prices, then in this case consumer's surplus will be smaller. Thus, when the seller makes price discrimination and sells different units of the good at different prices, the consumer will obtain smaller amount of consumer surplus than under perfect competition. So when a seller makes price discrimination and sells different units of good at the different prices, मतलब वो आपको बोले कि फर्स्ट 10 यूनिट्स आपको 10 रुपये में मिलेंगे, फिर 11th यूनिट से लेकर 20 यूनिट तक 20 रुपये में, ऐसा कुछ सिचुएशन होगा तो कंज्यूमर सरप्लस कम होते जाएगा, राइट, दैन अंडर परफेक्ट कंपटीशन, क्योंकि ये तो आपका जो केस है ये परफेक्ट कंपटीशन के अंदर प्रिवेल कर रहा है. ठीक है. does when a seller, okay, if the seller indulges in perfect price discrimination, that is, he charges price of each unit of commodity equal to what a consumer will be prepared to pay, then that case no consumer surplus. कैसे? मैं बोलूँ कि मेरा वैल्यूएशन 20 है, वो बोले प्राइस भी 20 है, वो बोले 18 है अगले वाले का, तो वो भी बोले 18 है, तो ऐसे करके तो 0 0 0 ये सब 0 हो जाएगा, राइट? Consumer surplus and change in prices. In our above analysis, consumer surplus will be explained by considering the surplus of utility in our money value, which a consumer obtains from the given quantity of the commodity rather than nothing at all. However, viewing consumer surplus derived by the consumer from the consumption of a commodity by considering it in all or none situation as rather limited uses. In a more useful way, consumer surplus can be considered as net benefit or extra utility which a consumer obtains from the change in price of a good or in his levels of consumption. Graphically समझने की कोशिश करते हैं. When TD shows the demand curve of food, the price OP of food, the consumer buys OQ of the food. OP पे वो OQ buy कर रहा है, ठीक है. The total market value which he pays for OQ is OPEQ. OPEQ ये हमने अभी भी इधर देखा कि वो जो पे करेगा वो ये एरिया होगा, तो वो consequently this is going to be the area. That is price OP multiplied by quantity OQ, correct. The total benefit, utility or use value of OQ, quantity of food in the area, ODEQ. The total benefit, utility or use value of OQ food is ODEQ. ODEQ, yeah, this is the total benefit that you are getting, ठीक है. Utility basically, ठीक है. Thus consumer surplus obtained by the consumer will be equal to area PED, right? This is the area. Now if the price of food falls to OP dash, the consumer will buy OQ dash, quantity of food OP dash हो गया, तो quantity बढ़ा देगा, price घट गया, consumer surplus बढ़ जाएगा, P dash TD हो जाएगा, P dash TD ये वाला area हो जाएगा, ठीक है. The net increase in the consumer surplus as a result of fall in price, the shaded area ये वाला area gain है, पहले consumer surplus ये था, next वाला ये था, तो ये gain हो गया basically आपको. This measures the net benefit or extra utility obtained by the consumer from fall in price of food. This net benefit can be decomposed into two parts. First, the increase in consumer surplus arising on consuming previous quantity OQ. अब इधर से मैप करके देखो इसे. पहले जितनी क्वांटिटी कंज्यूम कर रहे थे उसी पे प्राइस फॉल होने का ये वाला एरिया, ठीक है. सेकंड, द इंक्रीज इन कंज्यूमर सरप्लस इक्वल टू द स्मॉल ट्रायंगल EST अराइजिंग ड्यू टू इंक्रीज इन कंजम्पशन, क्योंकि प्राइस घटने से आपने कंजम्पशन जो था वो ही बढ़ा दिया OQ पर. अगर आप पहले वाला लेवल कंज्यूम करते तो आपका सिर्फ इतना एरिया कंज्यूमर सरप्लस के अंदर गेन होता. कंज्यूमिंग प्रीवियस क्वांटिटी, ठीक है. मेजरमेंट ऑफ कंज्यूमर सरप्लस थ्रू मार्जिन इंडिफरेंस कर्व्स. तो अब हम मार्शलियन का हमने देख लिया. टू बेसिक assumption made by Marshall in the measurement of consumer surplus are utility can be quantitatively or cardinally measured. Already know, when the person spend more money on a commodity, marginal utility of money does not change. MU जो था वो constant था. Just in case, cardinally measurable, all that. Or when the price of a commodity falls as a result, consumer becomes better off, his real income increases, the marginal utility of a money remains constant. तो ये सब जो था वो हमने फैक्टर नहीं देखा था कि रियल इनकम बढ़ेगी तो उससे हम और कमोडिटी बाय कर सकते हैं. वो मनी कांस्टेंट अज्यूम किया था MU बेसिकली. इकोनॉमिस्ट्स लाइक हिक्स एंड एलन हैव एक्सप्रेस्ड द व्यू दैट यूटिलिटी इज सब्जेक्टिव एंड साइकिक एंटिटी एंड देयरफॉर इट कैन नॉट बी कार्डिनली मेजर्ड. दे फर्दर पॉइंट आउट द मार्जिनल यूटिलिटी ऑफ मनी डज नॉट रिमेन कांस्टेंट विद द राइज एंड फॉल ऑफ real income of the consumption following the change in price of commodity. The implication of Marshallian assumption of constant MU of money is that he neglects the income effect of price change, but in some cases income effect of price change is very significant, cannot be ignored. Marshall defends his assumption of constancy of MU of money on the ground that an individual spends a negligible part of his money on an individual commodity, and therefore it does not make any significant change in the marginal utility of money. But this not need not be the case in all commodities. Hicks rehabilitated the concept of consumer surplus by measuring it with indifference curve technique for the ordinary utility analysis. Indifference curve technique does not make the assumption of cardinal measurability or MU of money to be constant. However, without these invalid assumptions, Hicks was able to measure the consumer surplus with his indifference curve technique. The concept of consumer surplus was criticized mainly on the ground that it was difficult to measure in a cardinal utility terms. Therefore, Hicksian measurement of consumer surplus in terms of ordinal utility went a long way in establishing validity for the so he's just introducing the idea of um, the IC approach. ठीक है. Measurement of CS with IC. How consumer surplus is measured with the aid of IC technique is illustrated in 15.4. In figure 15.4, we have measured the quantity of commodity X along the X-axis, money along the Y-axis. It is worth noting that money represents other goods except of commodity X. We have also shown some ICs between the given commodity X and money for the consumer, the scale of his preferences being given. Okay. So note that the assumption of constant MU of money requires the indifference curves to be vertically parallel to each other. We know that consumer's scale of preferences depends on his taste and quite independent of the income and market price of goods. This will help us in understanding, these are just all revision pointers which we've already discussed. This will help us in understanding the concept of consumer surplus with the aid of ICs. Suppose the consumer has OM amount of money. Okay, OM is the amount of money that he initially has, which he spends on commodity X. सारा X पे खर्च कर देता है. Which he can spend on commodity X and the remaining on other goods. ठीक है. IC1 touches this point M. Okay. Indicating thereby that all combinations of money and commodity X represented on IC1 give the same satisfaction to the consumer as OM amount of money. Okay, because IC1 touch कर रहा है इस point को M को, ठीक है. For example, take combination R on the IC1. It follows that OM amount of commodity X and OS amount of money will give the same satisfaction to the consumer as OM amount of money, because both M and R on the same IC. We already know all of the same IC, same satisfaction, all of that. In other words, it means the consumer is willing to pay MS amount of money for OM amount of commodity. Okay, MS amount of money for OM amount of commodity, क्योंकि OS तो मैंने उसके पास फिर भी रह जाएगा. ठीक है, इसका इंट्यूएशन आना चाहिए. It is thus clear that given the scale of preference of the consumer, it derives the same satisfaction from OA amount of X as from MS amount of money. Okay? In other words, is prepared to give up FR or MS of OA, FR, for OA amount of commodity X. Now suppose the price of commodity X in the market is such that we get the budget line ML. We have the budget line ML now. We know from our analysis of consumer equilibrium that consumer will be in equilibrium when the given budget line is tangential to the IC, right? At point H, the consumer is having OA, which he was initially wanting to have, okay, and OT amount of money. Thus, given the market price of commodity X, the consumer will spend empty amount of money. ये पैसा चला जाएगा empty amount of money for acquiring OA amount of commodity X. The indentation follows from this point here. But as mentioned above, he was prepared to forego MS or FR amount of money for having OA सॉरी, ये पहले हम ये देख रहे थे MS या FR for OA, ठीक है. अब वो कितना दे रहा है? अब ही इज़ गिविंग ML सॉरी MT, ठीक है, बिकॉज ही इज़ ऑन H, ठीक है. Therefore the consumer pays TS और HR less. ये अमाउंट को कम दे रहा है. He was ready to pay this much. He is actually having to pay only this much. So TS or HR is the amount that is paying less. TS or HR is the consumer surplus which the consumer derives from purchasing OA amount of commodity. But in this way, Hicks explained the consumer surplus with this indifference curve technique, without assuming cardinal measurability of utility, without assuming constancy of whatever. Okay. Consumer surplus with declining MU of money. The magnitude of Marshallian consumer surplus as measured by the area under demand curve is equal to the measure of consumer surplus as measured by the vertical distance between the two indifference curves as obtained subject to the assumptions that Marshall initially made. It is that the MU of money income remains constant when price of a commodity falls and consumer spends more money income on that particular good. In terms of IC analysis, this implies that income effect of the price change of the quantity consumed of a commodity is zero. In our above analysis of consumer surplus through indifference curves, this means that ICs are vertically parallel, that is they have the same slope. Vertically given above a given quantity of commodity measured on the x-axis. For example, slope of the IC1 and IC2 at the quantity OA must be the same for Marshall's measure of consumer surplus to be true. Okay, so if we want Marshall's approach to be true, we actually need these to be vertically parallel. The assumption of vertically parallel indifference curves with zero income effect of the price change ensures that the amount of money that the consumer is willing to pay for a good rather than go without it does not change as the money income is given up to obtain larger quantities of the good. Okay. Now, if instead of the remaining constant, marginal utility of money declines, okay, the magnitude of consumer of surplus is smaller than Marshallian theory visualizes. Let's see through this, where the consumer is initially at equilibrium on point H, where the budget line ML is tangential. In this equilibrium position consumer is having OQ level of good X and empty level of money, ठीक है. He has to give up this level in order to get this, ठीक है. In other words, he has spent Px, which is the price of X, into OQ, which is the quantity that he is getting, is equal to MT, because this is the amount that he has to forego of the money in order to get OQ level of commodity X. To know how much money the consumer will be willing to pay for OQ quantity of the good X rather than go without it, an indifference curve IC1 can be drawn through the point M. Okay, so we can draw an IC through this point M. This is flatter since that is of smaller slope than IC2 for any quantity of X, indicating decrease in marginal utility of money, because we said that let's see what happens when MU of money decreases. It will be seen from the curve that the consumer is willing to pay MK amount of money for having OQ quantity of good X. MK amount of money for OQ quantity of X, ठीक है, point J. Okay, similar approach. Okay. Thus TK or HJ is the consumer surplus enjoyed by the consumer HK. HJ or TK. This is the level of consumer surplus that he is enjoying. Okay, because actually he has to give up this much and he's willing to give up MK for the same OQ level of quantity. Okay. Yeah. To compare this with the Marshallian measure of consumer surplus, which takes MU of money to remain constant, we draw through point M another IC naught, which is vertically parallel to the IC2. Okay. This one is parallel to this one, because that's what we said. For Marshallian theory to apply, these curves have to be parallel to each other. Vertically parallel indifference curves. Okay. Yeah. To obtain OQ quantity of good X, the consumer is willing to surrender MS amount of money, this much, MS amount of money for OQ level of the commodity. Thus, Marshall's measure of consumer surplus is TS, this much, or HR, which is larger than the consumer surplus TK or HJ obtained under the assumption of declining MU of income. Okay. Hixian 4 concepts of consumer surplus. Let's do this in another lecture. Thank you.